Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about engineer managers. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, would you say that it is essential for a software engineering manager to keep learning and keep themselves up to date with technology like the ways a software engineer does? Nope, not at all. I would say that you have no chance of doing that whatsoever, if you ask me at the very least. Like, I mean, we can discuss like degrees of things here, because just because you study in the same way as a software engineer does doesn't necessarily mean that you're at the same levels or things like that. What I usually say to engineering managers, one of the things that you need to know, I argue, is that you need to at least understand the technology stacks that you have within the company. And because the reason why I argue that, I'm not saying that you need to know how to code like all the software developers and stuff like that, but you need to at least understand roughly what tools that you are using. Because and of course, what commonly your engineers and like the people that work with you and so forth, like what does their rough workflow look like? The reason why that is important is because if you know roughly what everybody's doing, because as an engineering manager you usually have more than one team and so forth, if you know roughly what's popular and what most are using, that gives you a good sixth sense for when, say, you get another team or someone wants to do something different and so forth. And then you can sort of, instead of just sitting there and accepting, yeah, we're going to do, like, let's say an extreme example, let's say that most of your department, like everybody's working in .NET, and then one of your teams just goes, hey, we're building this thing here in Golang, for example. Now that should make you react a little bit, and you would go, "Oh, okay, but everybody else is using .NET. Why are you going to use Golang?" The reason why you want to ask that question is because you want to figure out if a team is a little bit, doing their own thing, or if they're not really thinking about it, because as a manager and so forth, your priorities should ideally be to benefit the company and so forth. That's a balancing act, of course, because teams should be a little bit able to make their own choices and so forth. But if you know that people are starting to do something that is widely different from what the norm is and so forth, and having those norms is usually a benefit to you, especially when you're going to do hiring and all that stuff. At the very least, even if you don't really understand necessarily what the answer is, like why they say, oh yeah, we're going to use Golang or Rust or like F sharp or something like that, like you may not understand exactly, but then you have the other thing that is also essential to a engineering manager, and that is that you have good people skills. You understand, like you pay attention to who of your engineers are among the better ones, like the people who usually know their stuff. They usually have a good reputation in the organization, and they're usually the voice of reason and experience and stuff like that. And you have a good relationship with those people. And then when you had a conversation and you realize that you're a little bit unsure about that thing because you know what most people are doing in your organization, then you can just ask one of your more trusted engineers, could you help me figure out if this seems reasonable? And then you can get their feedback because they are experts, and so they might be able to tell you that, yeah, that's okay, or no, no, actually I'm wondering if that's a good idea. And all of a sudden now you can get you can get a better sensation of if your hunch is good or bad. So as I said, it's not about you studying all the time. It's just about you trying to understand roughly the main tools and the main practices that people are using. Because even if you allow teams to a lot of freedom, it's always good to have a bit of an understanding of your landscape. If you take me as an example, I'm not an engineering manager. I am a principal engineer right now. And for all intents and purposes, basically you can imagine that I do the same thing, but of course to a much deeper depth. So what I usually do, it's one of the first things I do and I give you the same tip, because you can do this as an engineering manager as well, and you don't have to do it like me or anything like that. I can just very warmly recommend it, and that is that I usually create a little bit of a table overview. So all the teams I manage, I have 18, 20 teams, something like that, with various technologies and stuff like that. So I create a bit of a spreadsheet where I know that, okay, so in all the front-end developers, they're using these tools roughly, because this is usually the stuff that you put on the job specifications if you're hiring new people. Those are the main tools that you're looking for, right? So map those out so you know what all the teams are using, because that gives you a holistic picture of roughly what everybody is using and stuff like that, right? I do that to a very long extent. Like I go into the source code and I check everything from, are they doing tests, like all these more technical things, right? You may not necessarily have to do that, but at least the basic tools and the like cloud providers or whatever they're using in their setups is very good for you. And then you just have a spreadsheet of that, so you can keep track of what's going on in the various projects at a high level. That is enough for me at the very least to make sure that I know that, okay, if I'm in a meeting with someone and they ask me, okay, what should we be betting on, or like what technology choices, and if, for example, someone is starting a new project or stuff like that, these sorts of questions very organically come up, and then I know that, well, in that team they have these things and that team they have those things, so around there is something that would fit very well into our current setup. And then of course you also have like the various team members, and you know roughly in that team you have some really excellent developers who sort of know what they're talking about, and we might ask them for some feedback on our thoughts and suggestions. I always try to connect with the people. If I'm making decisions as a principal engineer, for example, I have a very, very strict rule about that. I do not care what your role is within the organization. If you're making decisions on behalf of anybody or so for this, myself included, I won't make those decisions. I usually make recommendations, and then I invite people to say, all right, Frederick, we think that you are wrong about this thing. Cool. Let's present our arguments for that. Like, it's always a discussion, right? Because even though I might have a role, like say you're an engineering manager or something like that, I argue, as at least what I try to do as a principal engineer, my goal isn't to get my way. My goal is to make sure that we meet our goals, everything is on budget or so forth, and then we have all the quality checks in place, and like that the company is doing well, like all the teams are happy and they're doing well, right? And in some cases I might have a better idea of how to do that than another person, but I have to make sure that I'm not missing something. So be a little bit humble and present your ideas and like your suggestions and ask people what they feel. And sometimes, of course, you're going to present something where like everybody's really like on board with it and so forth, and you're going to have to pull rank and so forth. But on average, it's really good for you to have that holistic understanding of your teams, like what tools they usually prefer, because especially if you're going to hire new people, if you're going to like pull people in, then you know roughly what sort of profiles are going to fit in your team, because you know who's working in the teams and you know roughly what tools and practices they follow. And if you're going to move people around and stuff like that, you have this sort of landscape view of the technology and the people in your organization. That's what you should focus on. So to summarize it a little bit, you don't have to do like daily learning like all the different developers and like learn technology at that level, but it is really good for you to at least understand a basic set of tools that your front-end developers are using, or like your back-end developers, what are they on, and like what type of cloud providers, if you're using cloud provider, like what is the infrastructure roughly, like the names and generally what it is about. You can take a very basic crash course into this thing, you don't have to understand more than like this is roughly a popular tool or so forth and so forth, because as I said, your goal isn't to give them advice on how to implement things. Your goal is as I like to say, to keep them a little bit honest. So if something is very well established in your company, you want to be the person who can detect that they are going to do something that is very different, and then just ask them, can you explain like why not follow the stuff that everybody else is doing? Why is this thing better? And if they give you a really good answer, cool, let's go with it. If you start being a little bit unsure, then you go and talk to some of your trusted, like your go-to developers who know that like they are usually very level-headed and they know their stuff, and ask them, could you do an evaluation here and just make sure that it seems to be on the level? So what I want you to take away from this is that no, engineering managers, I don't think you should try to be, I mean, if you have been a software developer, that's great, but I don't think that it's a strict requirement. It's very useful for you to be a technical person, as I like to say. Like, I would love to have more technical gifted people in management roles, but the end of it. Like if you have a job that basically is all about meetings and people and things like that, you're not going to be able to sustain like the same level of coding experience and coding familiarity. So if you are a non-technical engineering manager, it's not the end of the world. You can do the job and so forth and so forth. My suggestion to you is to focus on just learning at least the names and what roughly is what things are being used within the teams that you are working with. The big tools, a good rule of thumb is the stuff that you would put on a job specification. So if you're going to hire for a new team, these main tools and practices, you should have a rough idea of what that is, so forth. Like take a crash course, take a Udemy course, like a really big basic intro. You don't even have to like remember all of it, just know what it is about, and know that when people discuss these things, try to make sure that you know the names and roughly what your teams are using, so that you can check if something seems a little bit off, or someone's saying that, oh, we have to use this completely different thing, or we are not going to do the thing that everybody else is doing. Question them, be able to to ask a question in that situation and just ask them. But our teams are solving problems all the time with these tools and that and so forth. Why not, what's just so different about this sort of situation? To keep people a little bit honest, like ask follow-up questions to people when you have new projects or stuff like that. And then the second part is create a really good connection with, like, keep a lookout for the most dependable senior experiences that you have in your organization, because it is invaluable to have a good, you should ideally of course have a good connection with all of your people, right? But especially true for the people who have like proven through various means that they're really dependable, they usually deliver, and they know their stuff. Because when you get a little bit unsure in those discussions that you're part of and management and stuff like that, if you should do A or you should do B, you can connect with these people and ask, hey, could you fill in the gaps for me a little bit and see if this seems to be on the level. Those two things together, if you're good at that, you're going to be a pretty decent engineering manager, even though you might not have a full-fledged software development degree and like all of that stuff and so forth. That is of course the best situation to be, but at the same time we have to be a little bit realistic here, guys. We can't force the whole IT world to just say, no, we're only going to hire full-fledged engineers to be engineering manager, because it's just not realistic. But at least this will give you quite a lot of the benefits. Have a great day.